Greetings all, and welcome to the full version of my Italeri 1/72nd scale P-51A Mustang double build. With the newer kit, which is a re-release, I'll be doing Miss Virginia based on poll votes on YouTube. And for the second-hand Mustang I bought, I'll be doing it as a RAF Desert Mustang from 225 Squadron. I'll also be adding 3D printed interior sidewalls as well as 3D printed wheels to add a little bit of extra detail. I do a little bit of experimenting with some oil and enamel weathering, and I attempt to vacuform replacement canopies to improve these kits, but that goes a little bit messy. So without further ado, let's get into these two Mustangs. To start with, I washed all of the sprues and my 3D printed parts in some warm soapy water, and once dry I cut out the fuselage halves along with the cockpit floor, which I removed the rudder pedals and radio area from. I cut out the included seat and radio area from the kit, and then used a file to sand away the seam lines and any remaining sprue marks. Initially, I glued the cockpit floor to the right fuselage half, but then removed it and cut out the instrument panel and control stick. Some Deluxe Materials Rocket Odorless CA glue was used to glue my resin sidewall details to the fuselages, and then I glued the kit's seat and control stick to the included cockpit floor and did a quick test fit. The radio stack and inside of the rear scoop were glued to the right fuselage, and then I glued the resin rudder pedals and floor details to the cockpit floor and left wall to the left fuselage. Initially, I hand painted the interior with Vallejo Model Air IDF green, using water to thin down the paint, but after 2 coats, my airbrush setup arrived, so I ended up finishing the IDF base coat off using the airbrush. Returning to the brush, I hand painted the instrument panel's trim with IDF green, then painted the various sidewall details and wiring, radios, throttles, control stick, instrument panel and cockpit floor with Vallejo model color flat black and a fine SMS brush. Model color flat white was then used to dry brush some of the raised details, gauges and buttons throughout the cockpit, and to paint some of the finer details I used Model Air aluminium, Vallejo model color flat white, Vallejo model color vermilion red, and Vallejo model color deep green based on reference photos. Initially I had considered doing an instrument panel, but the raised details included in the kit's one seemed so nice, so I decided to just stick with them. Photos seem a little bit limited of the A model's cockpit, so I largely used War Thunder as my reference. After some touch-ups, I painted the headrest cushion, control base cover, and the raised seatbelts with model color US Field Drab, and then added some chipping. To my knowledge, the Mustang floors were largely made of wood, so I used model color buff to dry brush some wood scratches on the floors, and then used some Model Air aluminium to paint the rudder pedals, and also dry brush the seat and cockpit sidewalls for some metal chipping. I fixed up any mistakes and toned down the chipping by applying small amounts of IDF green to cover some of the aluminium up, and then I used buff for some additional wire details and to dry brush over the areas I'd painted with the US Field Drab. I found the buff made some of the leather parts a little bit too lightly coloured, so I went over the top of them once more using some saddle brown. Satisfied with the painting, I finally applied some Tamiya black enamel panel wash over the entire cockpit of both Mustangs. This wash flows into all of the recesses, helping to highlight the details, but also makes everything a little bit dark. To fix this up, I removed the excess enamel paint from the cockpit using a fine brush dipped in some enamel thinners. One advantage of painting the cockpit with acrylics is that the wash and thinners can be applied without having to worry about damaging the acrylic paints. Once the excess panel liner had been removed, I dabbed some Vallejo gloss varnish onto all of the gauges to give them a glossy behind glass effect, and with that the cockpit was done. Before assembling the cockpit and the fuselage halves, however, I had to make the assembly for the propeller. A fair bit of sanding was required, and the parts didn't fit too well together, especially on the newer Mustang. Perhaps this is because the tooling has degraded a bit due to age. Once the propeller was assembled, I glued the tail wheel and cockpit tub into place, along with the instrument panel. I found that the fit was okay, but the cockpit was sitting about 2mm lower than it would have without my resin sidewalls. Continuing on, I ran a bead of glue around the fuselage halves, held the propeller into place, and then joined the two fuselage halves together. The fit was pretty good, and even with no sanding, there was no noticeable gap between the halves, despite the resin cockpit. I held the first Mustang's fuselage together using some ball dog clips while I glued the second kit's spinnered parts together, and once that was assembled, I joined the second Mustang's fuselage halves together and once again had no fit issues, but did need to do a fair bit of cleanup on some of the plastic parts. While the fuselage halves both bonded, I moved on to cutting out both aircraft's lower wings and their two upper halves. The wing attachment points required a fair bit of sanding to clean them up as they were rather thick, and once I'd done that, I used a small pin to drill out the holes for the American P-51's drop tanks, and a knife to cut out the holes for the 6 machine gun shell ejector ports, and for the British aircraft, I cut just 2 of these out for the 20mm Hispano cannons. The wing halves were then joined together, and for both kits, the wings fitted together well, though some additional sanding was required on the wingtips. For the British Mustang, I cut out the 2 pieces with the cannons moulded to them, while 2 very similar parts are included with machine guns for the American one. After these parts were cleaned up, I added them to the wings, though both the machine gun and cannon parts had quite a large gap between them and the wings. I added the attachment points for the American Mustang's drop tanks, and after some sanding around the fuselage points, both Mustang fuselages were glued to their wings. These parts were fitted without any major gaps or issues. The horizontal stabilizers were cut out and cleaned up, followed by the tail and main landing gear bay doors, main wheel struts, the air scoop intakes, and the rear scoops door. These parts were all cleaned up and then glued onto both Mustangs. By now most of the parts except for the canopies had been added to both models, so I began to prepare them for painting by filling in the gaps using some Vallejo water-based putty. The gaps were mainly on the wings and joints between the fuselage, with the worst of them being between the machine gun and cannon attachment parts on both of the wings. I also found I had to re-glue the British Mustang's wingtip as it must have come loose somehow. If any of the panel lines were lost or softened too much by sanding, I used a panel etching tool and a knife to rescore them. The main wheel doors were last to be added and required a bit of sanding to get a good fit. I was unsure if P-51A's Mustang landing gear doors dropped from a loss of hydraulic pressure on the ground, just like with the D model, but I have heard that they may have had some sort of lock to prevent this, so I decided to glue them in the fully closed position. This would still be accurate if the aircraft had only just been switched off on the ground, or if it had been fired up and was getting ready to take off. Once both Mustangs had received a fair bit of sanding, I masked off their cockpits with some white tack and moved on to priming. Both aircraft were primed using Vallejo's gloss black primer with a ratio of approximately 18 drops of flow improver, 4 drops of acrylic thinners, and 18 drops of primer. I applied it to the first Mustang quickly in several light passes, gradually going over the entire model on the upper surface until the aircraft had a solid gloss black coat. I then repeated this process on the second Mustang's upper surface, and once that was done, I returned to the first Mustang and primed its underside in the same manner. Once the second Mustang had been primed on the underside, both aircraft were then set aside for 12 hours while the primer cured before I would move on to painting. I moved on to applying a base coat of Vallejo Model Air aluminium for both of the Mustangs. This was intended to provide a more vibrant base colour for the camouflage colours, as well as act as the unpainted spinner colour for Miss Virginia, and since I also then sprayed both aircraft with some chipping fluid afterwards, I was originally intending for this to act as a metal chipping base. But after I'd applied the chipping fluid, I ended up changing my mind, as I wanted to go with something a little bit more restrained and easy to control than my experiences of dealing with chipping fluid had been. I started painting the camouflage with the lightest colour first, which for both aircraft was Vallejo Model Air number 43 Neutral Grey. This was mixed with 3 drops of Vallejo Acrylic Flow Improver, 2 drops of acrylic thinners, and 8 drops of neutral grey. I applied the paint in the middle of each panel first, and then gradually did several passes over the entire model until I had a nice uniform base underneath. I'd done a lot of pre-shading with my 190 kits, so with these two I wanted to experiment with post-shading instead. So once the neutral grey had been applied and had a few minutes to dry, I then added a few extra drops of neutral grey mixed with some Vallejo Model Air Light Gull Grey. This slightly lighter mix was then applied on the control surfaces and randomly around some other panels to create some lighter and darker areas, with the purpose of creating variation between panels to simulate age and repairs, as well as to highlight certain details. I didn't have an exact ratio I was using, and after some of the initial highlights and variation, I ended up adding more light gull grey into the paint mixture, making it even lighter, and then I used this to highlight the fabric elevators and some other random panels and spots on the underside of both Mustangs. To create some sharper edges and more contrast, I used some white paper as a very crude mask. I wasn't using a particular pattern, but rather just experimenting, and I rather liked the results. Once I was done, I let the paint cure for a few hours, and then masked off most of the underside of both Mustangs before painting the upper surface. I couldn't find much info on the desert RAF Mustangs of 225 Squadron, but what I found suggested about 6 or so had been loaned from the American stock to the British, who were desperately after them mainly for reconnaissance duties. I found only one black and white photo of the aircraft, and it clearly showed a camouflage pattern along with the British roundels and squadron codes. I'd seen some suggest that these Mustangs were done up in fresh RAF desert colours, but I imagine the camo was a rush job, so I decided to go with the other interpretation, which is that the lighter Middlestone colour was simply sprayed over the original American olive drab. Going with this option meant I would be painting both Mustangs' upper surfaces with olive drab, so I mixed up 6 drops of Vallejo Acrylic Flow Improver, 3 drops of Vallejo acrylic thinners, and roughly 8 drops of Vallejo Model Air USAF olive drab, and sprayed this over the upper surface of both aircraft in several passes. This colour is a mid-war lighter olive drab, and with the silver base colour it turned out almost like a light brownish green, which I thought looked quite good. After the olive drab had a few minutes to dry, I once again moved on to some post-shading. Looking at photos, I found one particular reference of a rather clean looking Mustang, but I noticed it still had darker panels on the outer wings, control surfaces, along the fuselage, and around the engine. I'm not sure if this is a trick of the light, something to do with the weathering of the olive drab, which apparently weathered rather heavily during the war, or even perhaps some respraying of different colours as the aircraft was repaired or repainted. But I decided to use this inspiration for some post-shading on the upper surface. First of all, I mixed a few drops of the darker early war number 41 olive drab in with the other olive drab, and sprayed this over the panel lines and in the darker spots I noticed in these photos to create the same sort of patchy, almost faded effect on the lighter ones. To then create some highlights and add more fading to the paint, I mixed some of the model colour flat white into the olive drab mix, and applied this one along some of the other panels, though I had to be very careful as I found the white was a very strong colour to mix in. In some areas, in fact, I was a little bit too heavy with the white mix, so I toned this down by doing a few light passes over both models with just olive drab, and with that I was really happy with my upper surface camouflage shading. Miss Virginia was pretty much done, but the British Stang would obviously need its camouflage patterns. Unlike with the 190s, I decided to go for a sharper camouflage edge and attempt some masking. However, as you'll see, the materials I chose with the acrylic paints proved misguided. I printed out some 1/72nd scale plans for the P-51A and used a pencil to draw the camouflage shapes, and then cut these out and secured them to the model with Tamiya masking tape. To then keep the edges of the paper from flying off as I sprayed, I used some AK Interactive black masking putty to hold it down and blend the edges. I found this sticky and fiddly, but it appeared to mask the olive drab rather well. I initially mixed up 4 drops of Vallejo acrylic thinners with 5 drops of Vallejo Model Air Middlestone and began to apply it onto the model, but I found this colour to be very tricky to airbrush. It seemed to be too thin, got really wet and saturated rapidly, and I had a fair bit of spider webbing, so I decided to add a few more drops of the paint to make it a bit thicker, but I still had to be very careful and not apply the paint too thick and quick. After the first few coats were dried, I then mixed some model colour flat white in with the Middlestone and created some highlights and faded areas. I then sat both aircraft aside to dry for a little while, and then I began removing the masking tape from both Mustangs. While Miss Virginia turned out pretty good, apart from a few chips and slight imperfections, the British Mustang's upper surface masking did not work so well. Yeah, who would have thought the water-based paints had water in them, and that managed to penetrate or saturate the paper slightly, leaving a very slightly visible light coat of Middlestone that the putty then clearly masked the edges of more effectively. Not feeling particularly inspired to try another method of masking, I decided the best solution was to simply respray over the olive drab to remove the lighter mark between the paper and the Middlestone, and then I also had to respray some of the Middlestone, and its rather temperamental nature made it rather hard, so I suffered a fair few imperfections and ended up with a very soft and messy looking result. I did consider stripping everything back, but decided to just use it as a bit of an example of what not to do in the future. So the next thing I did was to fix up some of the chips and imperfections on the underside of both aircraft, which I did by using a brush and a tiny bit of the Model Air neutral grey. Because I'd done a lot of post shading on the underside, a lot of areas didn't quite match the out of the bottle colour of the neutral grey, and it was a bit darker in spots. But I thought it kind of looked like a few patched up areas, so I wasn't too unhappy with it. Satisfied enough with both paint jobs, I decided to seal them in and prevent any more disasters from happening using some gloss varnish. The gloss varnish would also help to prepare the model for decals by providing a smooth surface for them to apply to and reducing the chance of any silvering. After the gloss varnish had had 12 hours to cure, I decided to have another gamble with some masking, and used some model colour flat yellow and Tamiya masking tape to spray the yellow markings on the British Mustang's leading edge of the wing, rather than relying on the decals. While the yellow markings dried, I hand painted the spinner with a few coats of Vallejo Vermilion Red. I then made a bit of a mistake on Miss Virginia and painted the olive drab part of the spinner with the olive drab number 41, which was a bit darker than the base camouflage. I decided to roll with it though, as I'm sure that many spare parts were not always the same age, or even had variations of olive drab in some cases. Both aircraft spinners received a few more touch-ups, and then I left the models aside and addressed the wheels. I found that the wheels included in the Italeri Mustang kit were a little bit inaccurate. Looking at some pictures of the Mustangs I was making, they also seemed to have the later D model style wheels with the hubs and the diamond tread, so I decided instead to try 3D printing some files I found on Cults from Real Dave Winter, a link to which I'll leave in the description. I had to scale them down from 1/32nd scale to 1/72nd scale, and after I printed and cleaned them up, I sprayed all 4 of them with some Vallejo Gloss Black Primer. To attach the wheels, I trimmed off the main strut's attachment point for the original kit's wheels, and then simply superglued them into place. Before doing any decals, I decided to add some extra details and also clean a few other things up, starting with painting both Mustang's wheelbase with a few coats of Vallejo Model Air 71010 interior green. I also peeled some of the Model Air Middlestone off somehow with the Tamiya masking tape for the yellow, so I used a brush to try and neaten things up by applying some of the Middlestone. The propeller blades and all the tyres were then painted in Vallejo model colour flat black before I moved on to the decals. For Miss Virginia, I had all of the decals needed in the original kit, but for the British Desert Mustang, I had to scrounge around for some spare letters, though I was able to use the kit's original RAF decals and fin flash, which, despite the kit being second-hand, were still in pretty good shape. I applied the decals by cutting the ones I needed out into manageable sections, and then stick them in some warm water for a few seconds, and once they start to come loose of the paper, I slide them onto the model using a brush or my finger. I found that the spare Academy decals I used for the lettering were rather fragile, and also not quite correctly shaped, and folded up, so in the end I decided to remove them and figure out something later on for the lettering. Miss Virginia's decals were the newer cartograph type, so all of them went on easily, except for the damn fuselage stripes and roundel. I probably should have just used the roundels and masked or hand painted the white striping, but after a few minutes of fiddling around, applying a lot of water to the model to help slide the decal into place, and a little bit of swearing, I managed to get them close enough aligned. Miss Virginia's white stripe decals did silver and didn't quite line up perfectly, but it worked out better than I imagined, and they were able to be cleaned up a little bit. After some final adjustments, I then applied some Vallejo decal softener onto all of the decals to help them soften into the surface details of the model, and then I applied some Tamiya decal adhesive to help them further stick down to the model. The decals were then left for 12 hours to set before I touched up some of the white markings on the stripes on Miss Virginia by brush and added yellow tips to the propeller blades. I still wanted to do some extra touch-ups, but I decided to apply some matte varnish early so that I could protect the decals. I really should have masked the spinner on Miss Virginia though, as I still wanted it to be glossy aluminium on the very tip. The matte varnish was given 12 hours to cure once it had been applied, and with the decals now protected, I decided to address the lettering on the RAF Mustang. I didn't have any appropriate decals left, so I decided to try printing out some letters using an RAF font, and using them as a reference to create masks out of Tamiya tape. Once the Tamiya tape masks had been applied onto the model, I applied some Vallejo model colour flat white, although I have seen a few different interpretations of this scheme using colours such as blue for the lettering. I made sure to apply the white in thin layers and build them up quite slowly, and to my surprise, it actually went pretty well. As soon as the paint was touch dry, I removed the masks, and any excess overspray was removed using a damp brush. The lettering was a bit messy, so I did end up doing some touch-ups with Middlestone and Olive Drab, and although they're definitely not as good as decals, I was still happy enough with them. I did a few extra touch-ups with yellow on both Mustangs, and at this stage painted their wheel hubs and landing gear struts with Vallejo Model Air aluminium, as well as Miss Virginia's spinner to try and get the gloss effect back. The tyres were then neatened up with flat black, and I gave the RAF Mustang a few more touch-ups so it was a little bit more presentable. With the protective layer of matte varnish on both Mustangs now dry, I turned my attention to the canopies, and here I decided to experiment a little bit. Although the kit canopies are decent in terms of their clarity and quality, unfortunately they're missing all of the front and midsection framework, so I decided to try making my own vacuformed replacements. First of all, I filled one of the kit's canopies with some milliput, which would help create a solid buck to support the plastic, and to replicate the missing frames, I experimented with some 1mm thick Tamiya masking tape. Once the milliput was solid and the masking tape was in place, I then used my budget dental vacuformer and some 0.7mm clear styrene to form two new canopies. Unfortunately, the tape ended up being too wide and shallow, so the framework detail didn't really come out as crisp or as in scale as I wanted. Still though, I pushed on, trimming the vacuform parts with scissors, which turns out were slightly curved. The curvature plus the slight oversized vacuform pieces made the parts a pretty poor fit, and separating the middle section only made alignment even worse. They were far from perfect, but I decided to still use them anyways for the meantime. When my vacuforming and my buck making skills improve, I'll definitely consider remaking them though. Before attaching the vacuform canopies, I did some final touch-ups on the interior using some flat black and IDF green, and then I applied several coats of the IDF green onto the canopy frames to create their internal colour. Once these coats were dry, I then scratched away any mistakes gently using a cocktail stick, before then applying the exterior camouflage colours and repeating the process. The front and rear sections of the canopies were then glued into place using Deluxe Materials Odorless CA glue, which is, I find, an excellent glue for clear parts as it dries really quick and doesn't fog them up. The fit of the canopies was, as mentioned, very poor, partly due to my cleanup being rather dodgy, perhaps also the way I'd positioned or designed the buck so that it would mould in the vacuform machine, and the slight increase in size, of course, due to the vacuforming. So in the end I had to fill in any of the gaps that were present using some Vallejo water-based putty. Unfortunately though, there were quite a lot of gaps, and since I'd already applied paint and decals, I couldn't really sand the putty smooth without damaging the finish. In the end I had to settle for just carefully painting over the putty, and trying to paint also along the panel lines to make it blend together and look a bit like some panel variation. Despite this though, you could still see a lot of the putty marks, which definitely didn't look too good. Miss Virginia's white stripes also needed some cleanup, so I repainted those using some flat white. Looking at the instructions and in reference photos, her wingtips were also left in bare aluminium, so I brush painted on 3 thin coats of Vallejo Model Air aluminium. The aluminium was also used as the base colour for the formation lights, and also to create the first layer of metal chipping. In pictures of both Miss Virginia and the RAF Desert Mustang, I couldn't really see too much paint chipping at all, so I only applied it very carefully, wiping most of the paint off my brush, before then dabbing it onto areas such as the wing root, edge of the canopy, leading edges of the wings, along some of the maintenance hatches, the spinner, and the leading edges of each propeller blade. These parts showed some light chipping in photos of Mustangs, and are also exposed to things like air resistance, small particles or debris, and general wear and tear from pilots or ground crew working on the aircraft. Once applied, I made the effect even more subtle by then going over the metal chipping using some of the camouflage colours to reduce the size and amount of metal chips. Recently, I've also started creating more superficial chips by mixing the camouflage colour with a little bit of white, and then dry brushing this slightly lighter colour in the same areas, which simulates wear that hasn't fully worn off the paint, which is a little bit more common than straight up paint flakes. While I then let the chipping dry, I painted other details such as the British Mustang's cannon barrels with Vallejo Model Air gunmetal metallic, and the exhaust which I'd left on the sprue were painted with Vallejo model colour gold. The chipping on the propeller blades was toned down with some flat black, and then I moved on to some enamel panel washes to highlight details and create a bit of post shading. Initially I tried some Tamiya brown enamel wash on the grey undersides, but I ended up only using this colour of wash on the light yellow Middlestone, which it worked really well on. For both Mustangs, I then used Tamiya black panel accent for the olive and the grey areas. The panel accent was applied along all of the panel lines, and once it had been applied and then dried slightly, I then rubbed off the excess using some Tamiya X20 enamel thinners. The thinner also helps the panel liner flow more into just the panel lines, further helping to highlight them and removing the darker areas from the surface of the model. Once the washes had dried, I then decided to try out a technique I'd seen other people using by getting my airbrush and some Vallejo model colour flat black and using them to create some exhaust stains. This would serve as the base colour, so I sprayed it more heavily on Miss Virginia based on reference photos, while I kept it a little bit lighter on the British Mustang. Speaking of looking at photos, I'd found a couple of pictures of the wartime Miss Virginia which showed quite a lot of very noticeable exhaust stains and streaks. They appeared to be very light in colour, and there also appeared to be a lot of streaking effects down the side of the fuselage. I also read a blog that someone wrote about making a 148 kit of Miss Virginia, and they suggested this white exhaust and the patterns were a result of the tropical environment and rain washing off some of the exhaust stains over time, creating the streaks, and the lighter colour of the main exhaust streaks could be from the constant use of a very lean fuel mixture to try and increase the aircraft's range. I decided the best way to try and replicate this would be to use some Italeri white oil paint. I let the oil paint sit on a piece of cardboard for a few hours to drain the excess oil, and then I mixed it with some AK Interactive odorless thinners and applied it thick along the whole side of the Mustang. Once applied, I then dipped a fine brush in thinners and created the vertical streaks for the rain by rubbing it over the streaks. This process was repeated a few times, and I also found using a larger brush to apply a puddle of thinners above the exhaust stains, and then streaking this down also created a very nice effect. I also mixed in some Italeri engine oil, which I used for some additional exhaust stains, and also to create some streaks around the landing gear for some variation, and also some grime on the underside. The white and engine oil mix was also used on the RAF Mustang, but as you can see, a lot more sparingly. After a few more touch-ups on Miss Virginia's exhaust streaks, I then moved on to painting and adding the last of the Mustang's smaller detail parts, starting with the drop tanks for Miss Virginia, since she was regularly flying long missions over Burma and is frequently shown with them on. The two halves for the drop tanks were cut out and then glued together, and while they dried I painted another coat of gold on the exhausts, before then sanding the drop tanks and spraying them along with the two Mustangs' landing lights, pitot tube and antennas with some Vallejo gloss black primer. The exhausts were glued into place and would later receive some more weathering, first in the form of some heavily watered down coats of Vallejo model colour Old Rust, followed by a dab of flat black to make the illusion of holes on the exhausts. Once the primer was dry, I sprayed the drop tanks in 2 initial coats of the darker Vallejo Model Air No. 41 olive drab, while the antennas were painted either US Air Force olive drab, which was the lighter drab colour, or Middlestone for the RAF aircraft, while the pitot tubes were both painted with neutral grey to match the undersides, and the landing light was painted a base colour of IDF green. After a few coats had been applied on the smaller parts, I then applied 2 more coats on the drop tanks, this time though with the lighter variation of olive drab to give them a faded and slightly patchy look to their paint. These smaller parts were then cut out of the sprue, attached to both Mustangs, and then I gave them a few more touch-ups. The instructions showed a hole present on the underside of the wings to fit the pitot tube to, but if it existed, it must have required being drilled out just like with the drop tank racks. So in the end, I used a pin to create a hole as close as approximate to where the instructions said they were, and then I attached the pitot tubes to that. I also had to poke out a hole in the rear canopy segments to fit the mast antenna. To finish up the exhausts, I applied some AK Interactive Pigment Fixer onto them using a brush, and then I dabbed over the top of that with some Humbrol Black Weathering Powder to create a build-up of soot on the exhaust stacks. This mix of pigment and also the darker soot was applied to the RAF Mustang cannons as well as Miss Virginia's machine gun covers. After the second coat of the lighter olive drab had dried on the drop tanks, they were then glued to their attachment points, and to add a tiny bit of detail to them without too much effort, I cut out some thin slices of sprue and glued them to the drop tanks, and then painted them vermilion red to create the fuel filler caps. The final bit of weathering was to add some dust and dirt to the undersides of the aircraft. To do this, I used some X20 enamel thinners to thin down some Tamiya enamel buff and flat earth, and then I started to apply the buff to the RAF Mustang on its wheels, the walkway area, and around the tail wheel. This acted as a wash, giving the impression of dirt built up in the wheels and some of the cracks, and a slight build up on some other spots. I used a similar technique, but with the darker flat earth, and also mixed in some Tamiya enamel red-brown for Miss Virginia to replicate dried and splashed mud from unprepared jungle airstrips. I also applied several thin layers of the enamel paints onto the drop tanks, a bit more heavily on the underside of the wings, and on the edge of the rudder and the tail, since dried mud would tend to stick to aircraft much better than sand and dirt. With the weathering completed, I applied some Tamiya X25 Clear Green onto the right nav light and middle formation light, while X27 Clear Red was then applied for the right nav lights and the top formation light. The landing light, pitot tube tip, and the unpainted parts of the landing gear struts were then carefully picked out using Vallejo Model Air RLM01 Silver, and to paint the lower formation light, I unfortunately did not have any clear orange, so I went with Vallejo Model Air Bright Orange instead, and later on applied some gloss varnish over the top of them to give them a slight shine. The final details to add was the rigging wire. I did this using some CA superglue and some AK Interactive Mega Thin rigging wire. Looking at references, the Mustangs appeared to have a small wire going from the mast antenna to the fuselage, then another one leading to the tail, and a third wire coming from the right horizontal stabilizer and going into the right fuselage near the window. The smaller bit of wire was a particular pain, but fortunately, after carefully positioning and holding it in place on both aircraft for quite a while, a small drop of glue accidentally ending up on the RAF Mustang, which I quickly wiped off, and a little bit of swearing, I managed to get the small wire segments on both Mustangs into place. The 2 larger sections of wire were then attached with much less fiddling. And after a second coat of clear green, clear red and bright orange had been applied to the nav lights, and the aforementioned gloss varnish had been applied onto the orange light, my 2 Italeri P-51A Allison Mustangs were finally completed. And here you can see the results I achieved with these 2 models. Now, I'll be honest, partway through this build I kind of lost my initial enthusiasm with this kit, so they did eventually become a bit of a case of get it off the workbench so they didn't end up sitting on the shelf of doom. But I am glad I continued to work on them to a level of completion that I'm happy with. On the negative side, I'm not really thrilled with how the vacuform canopies turned out. The fit and clarity aren't great, and they didn't improve the kit much beyond adding the missing frame lines. But in my opinion, experimenting is a big part of this hobby, and I've definitely learnt a few lessons about vacuforming from doing this build. Overall though, I'm really happy with how these aircraft turned out, especially with the post-shading, weathering, and how the details all came together. The mask lettering on the RAF Mustang was a lot of fun to experiment with, and while masking its camouflage pattern didn't go perfectly, I think I managed to save it with a few careful touch-ups, and once again I feel like I've learnt from my mistakes, and I'm already applying better masking techniques to future builds. I'm also pleased with my 3D printed sidewalls and cockpit detailing, which admittedly might be the most detailed parts of these older kits. Even though it's barely visible, I know it's there, and I think it makes a small but valuable difference. The 3D printed main wheels are also quite a nice improvement over the kit's original ones, even if I probably could have positioned them a bit better on the printer to get crisper details. As for my views on the kit itself, it went together okay both times. It seems roughly accurate in shape to my non-Mustang expert eyeballs, though I've heard that the wings may be inaccurate as they are definitely recycled sprues from Italeri's D Mustangs. The details are okay, though the decals are excellent, being cartograph in the newer kit. Even so, I still wouldn't recommend using the Miss Virginia fuselage stripes like I did though, as masking and painting would have been easier, cleaner, and with less chance of silvering. The Italeri reissue builds into a decent model, but at around about 28 AUD, I think it's definitely overpriced for an older tooling that's starting to show its age. As far as I'm aware, it's currently the only option if you want a readily available 1/72nd scale Allison Mustang, at least here in Australia, so I think it definitely would be great to see a new tooling of it someday. For now though, I'm happy to have two distinct examples showing the early Mustang's variety and character, and most importantly, I've learnt a lot along the way, and though it's an imperfect kit, if you really wanted to build an early model Mustang, which I think you definitely should as it's a criminally underrated aircraft, at least this kit is out there. Thank you very much for watching the full version of my Mustang builds. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please be sure to leave a like and also subscribe to the channel as it really helps out. And a massive shout out to my wonderful patrons for helping me to not only fund buying these kits, but also the products I use when I make them and the time I spend making these videos. I've already had a few suggestions from people about ways I could tackle the canopies, and at some point I definitely will make some improvements. I think though the most likely option I'm going to go with is eventually I want to try Academy's P-51B and C Mustang, and they have the same middle section of canopies, so theoretically I could make a vacuform one using that kit base part as it is, rather than having to fiddle around and try and make the frames with tape, which didn't really work so well. I've also bought a new pair of scissors that are a bit more straight, so for future vacuforming projects I'll be able to cut them much more precisely. And speaking of future projects, I'm hoping to have in the next week or so the Airfix 109F starter set's first episode out, since I've finished building it and I'm up to painting at the moment, so all going well I should have a video edited for that one coming pretty soon. I'm also still working on the Lancaster stop motion. I've been a little bit delayed by doing some extra 3D printing for some character designs, which I'm sure I'll be doing a post on. But now that that's all sorted, I should be able to get it out in the next couple of weeks, which I'm very excited to. Otherwise though, that's it for now, but until the next video, as always, take care and model on.